Bonjour, chers collègues, je vous propose...
Good morning, colleagues. Let's get started. First of all is the adoption of the agenda. Are there any comments? No? In that case, we can consider the agenda adopted. Secondly, Chair's announcement. As usual, our meeting is public and web streamed live. During this meeting, interpretation is provided in English, French, German, Italian, Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, Slovak, and Lithuanian, which will be passive only. We will also have interpretation into Russian for the item on the human rights situation in Belarus scheduled for tomorrow morning. I would also like to remind you that the plenary adopted 3 urgent resolutions on the 11th of September, the detention of EU citizens in the occupied areas of Cyprus, in the case of Victor Ingabire in Rwanda, and in the case of Abdul Aziz Goma, arbitrarily detained in Togo. Today we are witnessing a moment of hope in a landscape too often marked by injustice. Alaa Abdel Fattah, the British-Egyptian activist who has become a symbol for the fight for human rights in Egypt, was released on a presidential pardon at the request of the Egyptian National Council for Human Rights. For nearly 12 years, Alaa Abdel Fattah had lived almost uninterrupted in prison since 2014 because of his commitment to freedom of expression. Today I would like to pay special tribute to his mother, Laila Suif, and to his sisters, whom we welcomed in the European Parliament, who fought an admirable and painful struggle, hunger strikes, international appeals, demonstrations, and relentless diplomatic pressure. Their courage was instrumental in keeping the case of Alaa at the forefront of global attention. As chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, I welcome this release as proof that perseverance, international solidarity, and a constant call for fundamental values can make a real difference. This is not an outcome in itself, but an essential step. We hope that this gesture will not remain isolated, but that it will pave the way for further releases, also requested by this House, and for an environment where all human rights defenders can act without fear. The European Parliament has repeatedly called in its resolutions for the release of Alaa Abdel Fattah. These calls were part of a broader international mobilisation. These requests have found a concrete echo. It is therefore our responsibility to continue to support not only Alaa, but all those who are imprisoned, harassed, or intimidated for exercising their inalienable rights. May this moment be a milestone in the universal defence of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. We'll now move on to item 3, the Chair's announcements concerning coordinators' decisions. In accordance with Rule 220 of the Parliament's Rules of Procedures, the final minutes of the decisions of the DRA coordinators meeting on the 4th of September 2025 were uploaded to the intranet site, together with the other documents of those meetings. The decisions will be attached to the minutes of today's meeting, and if no objections are raised, the decisions shall be deemed to have been approved. Item 4. Adoption of the minutes. I now propose we adopt the minutes of the DRA subcommittee meetings of the 3rd of June and the 25th, 26th of June of this year. Any observations? No? We can consider those meetings minutes approved. Dear colleagues, item 5 is our first substantive item. This is the joint debate on the occasion of the International Day of Democracy on the 15th of September 2025. But this is also being celebrated in view of DRA's own initiative report currently being prepared on the EU strategy to tackle new theories against democracy, with our colleague Bernard Guetta as rapporteur. This debate will also be very useful for our reflection on the future of EU support for democracy in the world in the context of the debates on the next MFF. We are organising this together with the Special Commission on the Shield of European Democracy. I'm delighted to welcome my colleague Shabar Molnar, first Vice Chairman of this Special Committee, who is here beside me and will chair this item alongside me, as well as the members of the committee present in this room. I welcome the two eminent experts who are joining us for this point. First of all, welcome Mr. Richard Youngs. You are a principal investigator for the Democracy, Conflict and Governance programme. You will present this study commissioned by our subcommittee, co-authored by you, on the EU strategy to address anti-democracy narratives with a focus on the external dimensions. I would also like to welcome Mrs. Seema Shah. You are responsible for the Democracy Evaluation Unit at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. You will present the main findings of your organisation, International IDEA, of its annual report published on the 12th of September, which both provides an overview of global democratic health and also devotes part of its research to assessing the profound implications of global migration on democracy and democratic institutions. Democracy is at the heart of our subcommittee's work. Indeed, human rights and democracy are closely interlinked and mutually reinforcing. Human rights are the necessary foundations for the functioning of a democracy, while democracy is the form of government that best guarantees the protection and realisation of these rights. However, in 2025, the observation is alarming. Democracy is on the decline in the world, to the point that for the first time in 20 years, the number of autocratic countries will be higher than that of democratic states, and liberal democracies have become the rarest regime in the world. There were only 29 in 2024. In this context, where democratic space is shrinking dramatically, the European Parliament must remain a platform for dialogue on democracy and human rights. At the same time, it is crucial that the EU develop an appropriate strategy to support democracy in its external action as required by our treaties. Colleagues, without further ado, I am pleased to give the floor to Mr. Molnar for a few introductory remarks.
Thank you, Chair Satsuri. Dear members, dear speakers, I also would like to welcome you to this joint meeting of our committees. It is fortunate that we are having this joint exchange on the occasion of the last week's International Day for Democracy and having as the basis of our discussion these two timely reports. According to the International IDEA reports, over half of the countries assessed have experienced democratic decline since 2019, with our continent contributing for 38% of global rule of law deterioration. This is particularly striking given Europe's historically robust democratic performance. Meanwhile, authoritarian regimes now constitute the largest category of political system globally, with 72% of the world's population living under autocratic rule of some flavor or another. But, and it is okay, the International IDEA report also provides source of hope because despite global democratic recession, citizens continue mobilizing for democracy. Recent successful ousting of authoritarian governments in Guatemala, Zambia, Senegal, Brazil, or in Thailand shows democratic openings still occur. Both documents converge on key recommendations relevant to both EUDS and ROA reports. Enhance multilateral coordination, more flexible and rapid response mechanisms for democratic openings, specific initiatives addressing vulnerabilities to authoritarian appeal, and development of inclusive democracy narratives that incorporate values of tradition, belonging, and security that matter to all Europeans. So I'm pleased to welcome your guest speakers. We have, as my co-chair mentioned, Mr. Richard Youngs, Senior Fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program at Carnegie Europe, and Ms. Seema Shah, Head of International IDEA's Democracy Assessment Unit, which is responsible for producing the Global State of Democracy report. So first we'll listen to Mr. Richard Youngs. Please, the floor is yours at most in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Our report aims to do one very specific thing, which is to try and understand the kind of ideas and concepts that are driving this latest wave of authoritarianism. Mr. Molnar is right that authoritarianism continues to spread. Seema's very brilliant recent report shows this in detail. The challenge is that not only is authoritarianism spreading, autocracy itself is becoming more complex and more varied. And in particular, authoritarian regimes are becoming more skillful in rooting their actions in narratives, ideas, and concepts that seem to be gaining appeal amongst many citizens, many people around the world. So there's lots to say about this wave of authoritarianism, but our report focuses in on this very specific challenge of trying to understand the ideas, the concepts that are driving authoritarianism, and trying to ascertain what EU external action can do to try and address these emerging challenges. So we address in the report what are generally referred to as the authoritarian ideologues. That is, there's at the moment a significant number of works and very profound thinking emerging in favor of authoritarianism. These ideologues root their ideas in anti-democratic ideas and writings that go back a long way, right into classical antiquity and the ideas of the 19th century. There's a lot to say. We give a lot of detail in the paper. I don't have time to go into that in my presentation. I just mentioned very briefly 5 ideas, 5 notions that authoritarians seem to be harnessing with quite a degree of effectiveness as they build their authoritarian strategies. Number 1, the notion of expert rule, what is often referred to as epistocracy. There's a growing notion that the challenges facing modern societies are so complicated that they need the power, the influence of experts in order to try and confront these challenges, and that ordinary citizens are not well equipped to understand and resolve the complexity of our modern challenges. Number 2, a growing sense that democracy has tilted too far in the direction of individualism in a way that undermines the general will, the general interest of societies. This is the root of what has become known as dark Enlightenment thinking, the notion that societies need a more cohesive communitarian ethos in order to underpin their political functions. Number 3, crisis management. There is a widespread feeling that we are living in an era of almost permanent crisis, and that authoritarian regimes are better equipped at dealing with crises. Many of today's pro-authoritarian thinkers advocate a return to the kind of temporary dictatorship idea that was prominent in Roman and other times. The idea that governments need emergency powers, strong executive powers on a rolling basis in order to try to mitigate the successive crises that have affected democracies in recent years. Factor number 4, the growing opposition to progressive change, and as you mentioned, Chair, the notion that somehow societies need more authentic traditional values. And this is the root of what now is this very well-known phrase, this well-known notion that liberalism, from having been a counter to oppressive power, today itself has become a kind of repressive cathedral imposing certain liberal values on societies. Number 5, final point, order and security. The growing notion that societies are affected by growing instability and insecurity, and that authoritarian governance is needed to try and quell this disorder and insecurity. So just 5 ideas there. We explore these in more detail in the paper. Obviously, we're not saying we agree with these ideas, but these are the kind of ideas and concepts and narratives that authoritarian governments seem to be using with some effect around the world. These are not new ideas. The point is that these pro-authoritarian ideas have been around for a long, long time. There's a whole wave of authoritarian thinking today, contemporary ideas, that are giving a kind of modern reworking to these very classical arguments against democracy. There is then a debate about which of these arguments are most responsible for driving today's wave of authoritarianism. We go into detail in this in the paper. To summarize in one line, some people say it's the society's values, more illiberal values, that are driving today's surge of authoritarianism. Other people say, no, it is not that. It is the strategies employed by political elites in constricting democratic freedoms at a societal level. So bottom-up dynamics versus top-down dynamics. In truth, in most countries, it is probably a combination of these bottom-up and top-down dynamics that are working against democracy. Our paper then looks at some of the main works that have come out defending democracy on the other side of the equation. Again, we go into some detail in these. Suffice it to say here, our one headline conclusion is that there is a mismatch, there is a disconnection between all the pro-democracy arguments that have emerged in recent years and these pro-authoritarian ideologues. A huge number of books and articles that have come out defending democracy do not directly address these 5 elements of authoritarian narratives that we lay out in the report. The pro-democracy side of the argument tends to make fairly generic case in favor of democracy and suggests that democracies need institutional changes, they need policy reforms, they need broader democratic coalitions, they need stronger civil society roles in holding executives to account. All points well made and necessary, but we find in a way there's 2 separate arguments going on. On the pro-democracy side of the equation, people arguing in favor of kind of institutional tweaks to try and make democracy more resilient. But on the other side, the authoritarian ideologues speaking much more to basic sets of ideals that are driving their political projects. The challenge then is how the EU can incorporate this evolution in authoritarianism into its policies. We argue, we conclude that EU external support for democracy has improved immeasurably in recent years. Funding has kept at a relatively high level. Funding has become more flexible. The EU has used sanctions in a more targeted way. It has taken advantage to a reasonably significant degree to democratic openings as and when these appear. So a relatively healthy and encouraging improvement in EU external policies in recent years. But the next phase of the challenge clearly is to try and make sure that the external policies reflect these new authoritarian narratives. And this is very, very difficult to do. We argue this calls for a whole reworking of the democracy narrative, a much more targeted set of EU instruments to try and speak directly to and counter these authoritarian narratives. I can go into more detail in terms of our arguments about how this might be done, but I just finish off with some of the specific recommendations we argue that might be useful to do this, building on the already significant improvements that the EU has made in its external policies in recent years. Number one, the EU could try to develop these counter-authoritarian narratives much more systematically within multilateral forum. Second, the EU could and needs to adjust to the United States' retreat from democracy support to try and build a wider set of alliances and narratives against authoritarian ideals. The EU could benefit from much sharper funding mechanisms and the way that these might be designed in the upcoming MFF negotiations. The EU needs a specific initiative, we argue, to try and deal with these identity issues, these issues of traditional values that seem to be pushing against democracy in many places of the world. And finally, we argue that the European Parliament could be well placed to try and contribute more proactively to developing a more effective push against these authoritarian narratives, both in the committee, that the committee could very usefully extend its purview beyond the fairly traditional human rights agenda into trying to rework these democracy narratives in the future, as well as a democracy support and electoral coordination group that could be well positioned again to try and broaden out the narratives, the scope of pro-democracy work in the EU's external action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Youngs, for your presentation. So I give the floor to Ms. Seema Shah. Please, the floor is yours for at most 7 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the chance to share the highlights of the 2025 edition of International Idea's flagship Global State of Democracy report. This year's report, Democracy on the Move, provides an overview of global and regional trends regarding the direction and quality of democracy around the world, and presents new research on the question of participation in the context of migration, a key question for the future of democracy. Before we begin, it's important to understand how International Idea defines democracy. Our definition is based on two key principles. First, popular control over decision-making and decision-makers, and second, equality in the exercise of that control. We divide the concept into four broad categories for ease of analysis: representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. Each of these comes with a multitude of associated factors. Altogether, we cover 173 countries around the world, spanning the last 50 years, and measuring 154 individual indicators of democratic quality. The main findings of the report this year include, first, the quality of democracy around the world unfortunately continues to deteriorate, with 2024 the 9th consecutive year in which net declines outweigh net advances. Compared to 5 years ago, more than half the countries in our data set, 54%, have experienced at least one significant decline in a key factor of democratic quality, compared to 32% experiencing at least one advance. Examples of those factors include things like credible elections, judicial independence, freedom of the press, etc. When we look to see what specifically has changed, we find that declines have been most concentrated in the specific factors of credible elections and effective parliament under the category of representation, civil liberties and access to justice under the category of rights, and judicial independence, predictable enforcement, and personal integrity and security under the category of rule of law. But it is also notable that though they are fewer, some contexts do continue to improve, including in foundational elements of democracy like elections. When we compare 2024 to 2019, we find that Brazil and Poland have each shown significant improvement across multiple factors following a milestone election. In the case of Brazil, those improvements have spanned all four categories of our framework. Both of these contexts remain immensely challenging, but there has been some progress in reversing some of the declines that we have seen in the past, including the undermining of the rule of law and constraints on civic space. When we come to rights, the most far-reaching declines were in freedom of the press. Here, performance declined in 1/4 of the countries in our data set, marking the broadest decline in this factor since we began these measures in 1975. While 4 of the top 5 largest drops in freedom of the press were in already severely low-performing contexts, including Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, and Nicaragua, mid-range performing South Korea is also among this list of top 5 steepest drops. This was due to events like government-initiated defamation cases against journalists, clampdowns on individual programming, and raids on journalists' homes. It remains to be seen whether the new administration will be able to reverse some of these declines. In rule of law, drops were almost equal in number across the three factors of judicial independence, predictable enforcement, and personal integrity and security. About 13% of the countries in our data set were impacted in each of these factors. One somewhat surprising finding this year is that performance in absence of corruption is the only area where we have seen more countries advancing than declining. This is for the 15th consecutive year. Importantly, of course, half of these countries remain in the low range band of performance and still only represent approximately 10% of the countries in our data set. When we look at the regional level breakdown, African countries accounted for the largest share of global declines at 33%, followed in second place by Europe with 25%. Advances, on the other hand, were much more evenly distributed across the regions. But as we all know, political participation extends beyond the borders of one's country. In the second part of the report, which I don't have time to go over today, we focus on migration and democracy with an emphasis on out-of-country voting. And we find, mainly, that out-of-country voting has been shown to contribute to long-term democratic resilience, both in host countries and in countries of origin. But a key question here is balancing the rights and the voices of non-resident citizens with the priorities of resident citizens. Each of these groups deals with the consequences of new policies in very different ways. Most of our recommendations this year deal with out-of-country voting, but given the wide drops and steep drops we have seen in freedom of the press, it's worth recalling what we have recommended over the years in this regard. We have recommended things like governments ensuring strong independent mechanisms to receive and act on reports of violations against journalists. These include very customized mechanisms that can respond in real time and which can include things like personalized bodyguards, panic buttons, SOS hotlines, and other mechanisms to protect journalists from threats, including especially female journalists who are increasingly the victims of online harassment. Second, we recommend that governments support independent public interest journalism, including through tax concessions, and support organizations like the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which focuses on low and middle income countries who do not have the same level of capacity to implement these kinds of protections for journalists. Given the declining state of democracy and the current challenging context around the world, it is key to continue investing in democracy. In many regards, the future of democracy is being decided here and now in Brussels, given the leading role that the EU plays in democracy promotion around the world. One key milestone in this regard is the MFF. An International Ideas team in Brussels is actively following this file and eager to continue engaging with the European Parliament in this regard. This is the surest way to guarantee that the EU remains true to its fundamental values that are set to guide external action as stated in EU treaties. We look forward to continuing this discussion with the DROI subcommittee. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So let me open the discussion with a question to Mr. Youngs. Your recommendation emphasized the need for the European Parliament to, I quote, play an upgraded role in countering authoritarian dynamics and narratives. What will be the main recommendation you would want to see both in the DROA and the EU reports? And I would like to have a question to Mr. Seema Shah as well. You identify foreign agent laws and media restrictions as key autocratic tools spreading globally. What preventive measures could the EU implement to help partner countries resist such legislation before it becomes entrenched? Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to the chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, Mr. Satsuri.
Well, we'll open the debate with members. So I'd like to give the floor to the EPP first of all. I think Ms. Lakos is wishing to speak. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for this very inspiring presentation. I was very happy, to have a very fast look yesterday night on your study. Of course, I was unable to read it. That finally someone is tackling, the issue of narratives, because it's very at the core, of our fight for democracy. I would have two questions. The first one it relates to the fact that you have mentioned the pro-democratic forces studies. They focus very much on institutions, and while pro-authoritarians on ideologies, on ideas. And of course, those stick more with people. So firstly, what counter-narratives we could have, and secondly, whether you are aware of studies that delve into more also on the psychological side of these issues. And the other question of mine, of course, in the study you mentioned also that there is a global decline in democratic standards. So the question is how to promote democracy abroad, that we avoid, being accused with the double standards. And also that we avoid that we are perceived that, all of our efforts are politically motivated. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Now the socialists.
Gracias, presidente. Voy a hablar.
Thank you very much. I'll be speaking in Spanish. That will help me to be more nuanced. Authoritarian extremists 25 years ago asked for time because they said that their social model was similar to ours. My culture, my traditions, my tribal background, my religion means that I can't go any faster. That's over. Their democratic models are to seek electoral legitimacy, but with no checks and balances. Absolute power for strongmen. So now we're not going to be able to whisper in the ear of a government to tell them where they should go, because they are entrenched in different models. I just want to repeat an argument that Muniz heard me said a lot. A world of democracies is a safer world. We shouldn't just reserve democracy to the sphere of morality. Democracies don't tend to invade a country overnight. Democracies want parliaments, critical press. So a world of democracies is a safer world, not just a fairer world. So I think we have to characterize democracy that way in order to win some of the debates. Some of the successful autocracies, such as El Salvador, means that people are willing to sacrifice a great deal to have more security. There's huge amounts of support and approval for the president of El Salvador in spite of his authoritarian attitudes. And in Western societies, there's the wrong impression that we are suffering from a lack of safety due to mass migration. We've done something wrong so that citizens who have enjoyed democracy would be ready to sacrifice it for real or invented security. We have to call a spade a spade. As you said, we have to take measures at the first signs of authoritarianisms. We have to start calling the US a defective democracy. There are forced disappearances in the US. There are parallel security forces there who wear masks and pull people off the streets, so no sort of oversight for that. If we have to act when we see the first signs of authoritarianism, then we have to do so in all countries and not just in a few. And in conclusion, we could turn into a big Switzerland. The EU's incapacity to act faced with authoritarian regimes, with half the energy it uses when somebody gets closer to Russia. Laos is a problem because Laos is thinking of sending troops to Russia. And then we cut off funding to Laos. When have we ever done that for an issue of democratic quality? The question is when it's an issue of security, defense, and Russia, we'll put all our weight behind pressure on a country. When it's about counteracting authoritarian regimes, we are patting them on the back as long as they are geopolitically important. The risk is that we could turn into a big Switzerland, rich and isolated. Thank you.
Merci, Nacho.
Thank you, Nacho. Are there any socialist members from the special committee who would like to speak? From the special committee. Would you like to speak? Go ahead. You can wear both hats.
And on behalf of the SND group also. So I would like to ask both authors, given the sophisticated evolution of anti-democratic narratives, how can we better distinguish between legitimate political discourse and malign foreign interference when both may rely on similar arguments about democracy's shortcomings? Thank you.
Okay, for the Patriots, Mr. Vallet is not here. Who would like to speak? Go ahead.
Buenos días.
Good morning. I'm going to speak in Spanish as well. I do think that the focus of this meeting is not surprising, but it is typical of what we are seeing in the Democracy Shield. It serves less to defend democracy than to defend a series of groups and their ideology, which is under threat, and they're very scared of that. Hearing that there's been an improvement in Brazil, when under Bolsonaro there was not a single political prisoner, and now there are thousands, and they've had to have an amnesty because of the thousands of unfairly imprisoned people in absolutely tragic conditions. The fact that you've said that Poland has improved when there the abuse is committed by the government, which has been propped up by this parliament, whereas actually all of the rules of the rule of law are being violated many times more than the previous government, and they're removing all the restrictions, or you've removed all the restrictions that you had placed on the previous government in order to intervene in their democracy. This is obscene. Not talking about the worsening and the degradation in Spain of the state of democracy there. The fact that we have a government and a prime minister who is surrounded by criminals, corruption, links to Venezuela, business links, when we have the European Union financing Cuba, which is the country that infected the whole of South America, including Brazil, and Lula, supporting the oligarchs, the Venezuela that exports cocaine to the US and to Europe. Are these the signs of positive developments? I think it really shows what the real position is of this Democracy Shield. You're not defending democracy. You're defending the progressive values that you believe are democracy. I think we're on the wrong path if you are identifying Lula, for example, or Maduro, and identifying them with democracy. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. There's lots of questions so far, so I suggest that we give the floor to our guests to answers to this first round. Then we'll hear more from members. We still have time, so don't worry, there'll be time for more questions. So let's start with a round of answers to those questions, and then we can have more afterwards.
So the basic premise of our report is exactly the opposite. It's to take these pro-authoritarian narratives seriously, to see what drives them, and then to see how people's legitimate concerns might be addressed, but within a democratic framework. We're not talking here about what's going on within the EU. The report looks specifically at the external environment. It's complicated. It's complicated. It's not just about narratives. I think developing narratives, democratic narratives that speak to a wider part of populations, many of whom have lost the kind of instinctive appeal in democratic values. But it's not just narratives, because a lot of the pro-authoritarian arguments are not just about narratives. They kind of argue that authoritarian regimes are doing better. The evidence on this is very complicated. On many of these issues, authoritarian regimes are not doing conclusively better, but nor are democratic regimes. It's a very, very complicated picture. But the underlying kind of spirit of our report is to try and get away from this politicization of the democracy agenda, to try and recognize that there are genuine concerns driving some of these authoritarian trends, and to think that the challenge for the democracy agenda is not just to push back against repression, very brutal repression that is coming from authoritarian regimes across the political spectrum, but to try and understand the kind of ideational roots of why these trends are becoming so serious. I think here, this is why we argue that the Parliament might be in a position to assist, because a lot of this is about trying to rebuild bridges across the political spectrum that is represented in the Parliament, to try and make sure that the differences and cleavages and tensions that have emerged in recent years cannot be easily solved or resolved, but the issue is to try and make sure there are institutional frameworks for addressing these in a democratic framework. As I say, we do find that the EU has done a good job in pushing back against authoritarianism, against interruptions of constitutional processes around the world. But it's just become a more difficult challenge, because today it's not just countering and limiting repression, it's about trying to understand that there are kind of more deeply rooted ways in which authoritarian regimes are pushing back against democratic norms. It is about the EU, and these narratives need to talk about democracy in a way that resonates more with people's day-to-day lives. That's not a new point. That's often been said. There are organizations working on trying to develop democratic narratives that speak to people who may support more traditional values and the like, so it becomes more of a universally accepted agenda. The narratives in themselves are not panaceas. They can't solve everything. We're not arguing that, but they're just one supplementary potential contribution in addition to all the other things the EU is doing. The EU needs to link the democracy agenda indeed to its own self-interest, but the challenge, the difficult balancing act, is that it needs to do that without giving the impression around the world that the EU only supports democracy when it is in its interest. So we argue in exactly the same way that democracy is a force for stability, for stabilization, when it can work to the benefit of all populations around the world, not just to the EU's own strategic interests. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act that has to be drawn, we recognize.
So there was a question about how do we resist foreign agent laws, I believe, and foreign interference, cyber interference especially. So this is a difficult question to answer in any kind of concise way, but what I would say is that the first thing we would remind everybody is that we've spoken in the past about what we call countervailing institutions. So there's two important sort of features of democratic systems. One is checks and balances between different branches of government, and the other is this ecosystem that exists of these countervailing institutions, which include checks and balances, but which also include other kinds of groups and organizations in society, which include civil society, media, ombuds offices, anti-corruption agencies, etc., which all of these work interdependently and leverage each other's strength in order to keep an overall balance in place. And these institutions need to be leveraged with regard to foreign agent laws and foreign interference in order to make sure that the proper checks are in place from experts and from legislators to make sure that action is taken before these kinds of developments occur. We also have programming, International IDEA does, that works with election management bodies on the ground to be able to track the narratives that are coming through disinformation campaigns from abroad and be able to adopt strategies to effectively intercept those narratives and give capacity to electoral management bodies and other actors in the election space to counter them effectively. That involves not just communication against the narratives, sort of pushing the narratives away, but ongoing communication with the public in order to make them understand what it is that they're reading and hearing and why that disinformation is not based in fact and what the dangers are of that. And a lot of that comes down to regular communication by the electoral management body with the public, not just at a time of an election, but in an ongoing way. There was another question about how to distinguish between legitimate discourse and malign narratives. And I guess my question in response would be, it's important to first ask to whom the narratives are considered legitimate. Who thinks one set of narratives is legitimate and who thinks one set of narratives is malign? And to start by understanding the root causes of support for each of those. I think a lot of times we in the democratic sort of assistance space focus on institutions because that's where we've been trained to focus, that's where the power is. But we need to look more at the roots of support for some of these authoritarian narratives that Richard has spoken about and for what we would consider malign narratives, anti-democratic narratives. Why is there so much support for those? And we need to understand that so that we can counter or mitigate whatever it is that's driving that popular support. If we're able to do that, then a lot of these other problems would be less of an issue.
On va donc poursuivre.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next questions. Mr. Molazik from the ECR, please.
Szanowni Państwo, pochodzę z kraju, z Polski, który...
I'm Polish. I come from a country that has the fight for democracy in its DNA, and it has a fight for independence and sovereignty in its DNA. Poland is now free, but before we were occupied by Soviet Russia, before then we were occupied by Germany. We've experienced occupation, war crimes, and all that. So we're very sensitive, especially to double standards. In your report, you've identified some authoritarian threats expressed in different types of policies around the world. Unfortunately, we're seeing the same trends in the European Commission's policies. They are also using a double standard. When a country seems to act in along the same lines as the European Commission's ideology, it's considered a good country, a good government. When a government does not fall into line, then they're accused of having problems with the democracy in their country. When my party was in power in Poland, your report identified several obstacles to democracy, media freedom, and so on. And 2 years after the government changed. You no longer see those threats. You no longer say that the public media is illegally under the control of the government. You no longer say that the decisions of the Constitutional Court are no longer considered. You close your eyes to the trials of people close to the government. And you didn't close your eyes to that when it happened before. So it's just not credible. It lacks credibility because the narrative is just following the policy of the hypocritical European Commission. Why in the Parliament do we have a cordon sanitaire and the members of the Patriots can't take up important roles in the committees and the bureaus? Do you think this is a democratic standard or do you think it's authoritarian? Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Mlarzik.
Thank you very much. Is there another ECR member from the special committee who would like to take the floor? No? So moving on to Renew. Is there somebody from Renew? No? Then the Greens, Caterina Vieira for the Droit Committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and also thank you to the two experts who presented today their very interesting findings, and also thank you to the colleagues who are bringing things that, well, I'm sure some of them are very relevant. I was very interested to hear about the US and the need to not ignore what's going on there, but, well, with other things, maybe we'll just leave it at that. I would like to ask a couple of questions. First of all, something was said about the success of external action of the EU in supporting democracy and that there's a lot of success stories. I'd like to ask, could you illustrate one or two of the best cases perhaps that you think we were most successful in? On digital and maybe related to press freedom, but also to safe spaces online, there's a lot of negative examples. I'm also looking, are there positive examples there where digital tools or social media have successfully increased citizen engagement or transparency in challenging democratic environments? And finally, maybe a general question. How can we be better at understanding and countering these narratives? I think you spoke of 5 narratives. How can we be better at identifying and responding to them, especially in regions where the EU influence is more limited? Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. There are no members from the Greens from the Special Committee. So we move on to the ESN group. Mr. Jengen, are you going to take the floor? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to address Professor Youngs in English, but with regard to my German audience, I will continue in German. Sie haben
You've carried out a deep analysis of the situation, references to Plato and Aristotle and many other references and an academic and philosophical background. But what I didn't hear in your presentation is any kind of definition of democracy. And I assume that you have such a definition, and I'm sure you'll agree that democracy is not defined by what is to be decided, which specific political paths need to be taken, but rather how those decisions are made. That's what's decisive. Whether or not the majority will is represented in a parliament. This parliament is the rulership of the people. And here we're talking about a selection, an election, which makes the difference. And it's clear that here we're talking about external perspectives in your report. But at the same time, I'm sure you'll admit that the psychological mechanism of projection has a certain impact here, because the EU is doing precisely that and is becoming precisely that what it is trying to combat. So, for example, you said that the narrative of crisis through which autocratic regimes legitimize themselves, and precisely in the EU we have this sort of situation. that only certain views are tolerated in the European Parliament and others are excluded for being undemocratic. So this means that democracy is being linked to certain specific views. It's a fetish term to silence political opponents, which is being abused. In Germany, we've had the situation for quite some time that the established parties see themselves as the democratic parties. My party, the AfD, is being excluded for being undemocratic, even though we have the highest levels of inner party democracy because we elect our members and our executives based on a Swiss model. So all of this is done that we do what we can, but nonetheless we have been under investigation by our internal services in Germany. So we can't have a situation where there's only one opinion which is considered to be democratic. And now we're talking, I won't go into the comments on the EU Democracy Shield committee because I'm running out of time, but my question is Europe, which is becoming autocratic, is it credible in any way when it's coming up with policies and DSA and so on?
I've given 2 minutes to everybody and you've exceeded 3 minutes now, so you must conclude. Everybody has the right to speak, of course, but we do have rules and I have to uphold them. Are there any other MEPs that would like to take the floor at this point? 2 minutes, theoretically. Not any more than that. Mrs. Temido, you have the floor.
Merci, j'ai bien noté la règle.
Thank you. I have noted the rule. I am going to mention both matters of substance and form. We have this report. I flipped through it quickly, and I do think that it's a tool that the Commission once again is putting into place to peddle its propaganda narrative that's been in place for years now. There's an article that dates back to the 70s from Le Monde Diplomatique that talks about how the Commission peddles its propaganda to uphold its interests. So I'll come back to the matters of substance at the end. Now, on the form of this, the format, your study supports on page 9 semi-structured studies that have been carried out with funds from the European Union working on behalf of the EEAS, the Commission and civil society, etc. And when I read that, what comes to mind is I think to myself, where are the citizens of all of this? Did you reach out to political parties? I get the impression, really, that you've biased the vision of the report, and my colleagues have already stressed this. We can see that behind all of this, what's hiding is a will to cause harm to democracy at the end of the day, I have to say, because you define this by saying, what an autocratic discourse is and mention a few elements. But what I'm afraid of is the fact that you are denouncing the fact what's going on at the Commission, because I think that we've got an autocratic drift with the Commission going on here, that the Commission is implementing. And you're part of these tools that are peddling this. For years now, since the building of the European Union, we've tried to reach out to the Commission and to try and get them to accept the unacceptable. And I have to say, when we see that this report is based on studies that are behind closed doors, carried out behind closed doors, that's just not right. You need to campaign, reach out to people. You need to go to the grassroots level. And when you say what are you going to do when you say to people, change your cars in 2030? Are they going to listen? When you tell them that they've got to change their driving permits and resit their exams every 15 years, when you say to a Romanian, after the elections there was interference, that's the problem at the end of the day. You're trying to make people accept a report, or make us accept a report on elements that you've taken from literature. And I think that you'll be honest. I hope that you'll be honest about what is the ultimate goal of this report. Are you giving more teeth to the Commission to dictate the kind of democracy we have tomorrow? Be careful, because that's not what the people want. The people want true democracy. And the only positive, yes, as you've understood the rule, you're at 3 minutes now, so you have to conclude now, please. Yes, Chair, you are right about one thing. The states that have used this crisis to kill liberty, well, we have to say that France is part of that, and I conclude. Mrs. Temedo.
Obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question for our guests is the following. What are dictators standing to gain from this? You talked about various different characteristics and ideas that are present in the analysis of a series of different totalitarian regimes. And I would like to ask whether two characteristics that I identify and that a lot of us pick up on when we listen to our colleagues around the table, whether they're also present in the analysis you've carried out. One of these would be that authoritarians are gaining ground because their discourse is easier to understand. It's easier to point the finger at others than to look at what one is doing oneself, and that builds a series of narratives. It's much easier to point to others than to look at hard figures, facts, indicators, and to consolidate those and work with those. And that is why it makes it so easy. And so I wonder whether we should also deal with that ease of discourse with the strategy as well. That's my first question. Also, perhaps we are being undermined by poor examples, a lack of credibility in our external policies, issues regarding our lack of coherence and external analysis. Our member states some may also be undermining to a certain extent what should be held up as democracy and what democracy should be defined by, which is an image of truth and credibility and complying with different principles and criteria. The positive side of things is that citizens, fortunately, are not always won over by this. So I think that democracy is alive and well. And European citizens have taken to the streets over the last weeks and have forced the European unions to take a stance on Gaza, for example. So democracy is under threat, but there is cause to be positive as well. Now, when it comes to the global fall of the freedom of the press, how can we tackle that? How can we avoid this trend carrying on at a European level too, criminalising defamation and fostering independent work? What should we do to head that off? Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues. Does anybody else want to take the floor on this? I don't think so. I can't see anybody, says the chair. Ah, yes, you have the floor.
Voi vorbi în limba mea în românește.
Yes, I'd like to speak my mother tongue, Romanian. I read the report. I did understand what I think that some of us were meant to understand. This report was a sign, a clear sign. I looked at the content. I looked at the form of it. I didn't find any spelling mistakes, no. I looked at the content, and it was a very clear sign that in Europe, but not just in Europe, but in Europe is obviously the space that is most relevant to me. And I think that what we're talking about here is democracy. One colleague said that in Romania, the elections were cancelled when they shouldn't have been. And that's something that I often see happening in this parliament. People seem to be very much, or think that they're experts about what's going on elsewhere. I was in Romania. There were interferences, the same interference that we're seeing in Moldova right now. But the question is always the same. What should we do? What are we going to do to combat interference, to combat these things that are happening concretely around the world, in this case in Moldova and recently in Romania? We need to take action, but not just with words and declarations. We need concrete action. And I think that the problem is very serious, and it's going to continue to pop up in all countries where elections are set to be held in the future. If we continue to be mere spectators, then that's what will happen. I think that at the European Parliament here, we need a real, tangible report where we can face things down head on. And we need to call a spade a spade. We need to have the necessary financial resources to channel into this so that we can counter these trends without infringing on democratic values, of course. I don't want to add much more for now, but I think that in Europe we should be very cautious about this issue. And we shouldn't allow this issue to evolve any further. That's why we're here. We need to pinpoint the reasons behind it and we need to eliminate them one by one. Thank you.
Pas d'autres prises de parole.
No other requests for the floor? Okay, well, I had a reflection and a couple of questions too. Firstly, many of you spoke about the presentation and a report. It's not a report that's already exists. It's a report that's coming out of the subcommittee, actually, to be clear. This report is being carried out by Bernard Guetta, and there's a team of shadows working with him, as reports are always drafted. But before this report can come out onto the table and be worked upon and amended and presented to the committee, we thought that perhaps we needed a study before feeding into that report. So I want to thank the experts for the work that they've done based on a methodology. And I just wanted to clarify a point that I think is essential to these exchanges. As part of the methodology that we handed on to the experts, we wanted them to be able to inform us, brief us on the way in which European Union institutions respond to attacks on democracy. So, therefore, you should understand that it's very much to be expected that we should question the European level of responsibility for the methodology and the actions of the European Union that are undertaken when it comes to attacks on democracy. We could take whatever stance we want, but let's not misunderstand the work that's been done by the experts here. I wanted to ask a question that came out of the debate. How do you define a democracy anyway? Is democracy only defined by the method through which governments are appointed? We have elections, usually. So what are the conditions that should be placed around those elections? Free of interference? Can you give us some information on the principles behind that? Because I tend not to define democracy by the way in which leaders are elected, also principles, power, the power sharing, independence of the different instances, freedom of the press, the right for journalists to work freely without the media being concentrated in the hands of just a few people who could guide and take the media messages in a certain direction that suits them. So just between 5 and 10 universal principles that define or could help define what democracy is and distinguish democracy from totalitarian authoritarian regimes. You spoke about EU strategies and financing. Now, as we look to the new European budget, I don't believe for a second that the European Union is going to be able to offset the lack of funding from the Americans. We might say that here in the Parliament, but I don't believe that genuinely. So what can we do? Do we need to revisit our instruments and create new ones to adapt to the current reality on the ground? In the tools that we have right now, the instruments, are there some that we need to keep hold of? Do we need to come up with new ones? Those are the two queries that I had. Thank you. You have the floor.
These are two very good points. We don't argue that the EU can replace the cuts in US funds. Precisely because of that, we argue that the really essential thing is for the EU to work hard at building a broader set of international alliances in favour of democracy. And the general spirit of the report is in favour of a kind of more flexible understanding of democracy that is linked to certain processes with a core of kind of constitutional rights. But we do say there does in the future need to be a kind of wider spectrum of understandings of democracy. In that sense, I would just recall that this is not a political report. It's not a report about the situation inside the EU. It's not a report that in any way takes any kind of ideological position. Again, the spirit is that in its external policies, the EU would benefit from having measures that support consultations with a much wider range of citizens around the world to garner ideas on what their views of democracy are, what they expect from democracy. One point we make is that if the democracy agenda has become associated with one part of the political agenda, then that's something that needs to be looked at and potentially corrected. In terms of what the EU has done right, we would argue that in many places around the world, funds. This comes to your question about EU successes. There has been more of an orientation towards more grassroots organizations where citizens can engage more directly with political processes. That process still needs to go further. It's difficult to get support to this level. So we do argue in all this way there's a kind of foundation upon which the EU can build to take into consideration this broader range of understandings of what democracy is and why some authoritarian regimes seem to have been successful in presenting this opinion that authoritarian governance is better at dealing with crises or dealing with people's everyday economic needs. The evidence around the world does not suggest that. So it's in that sense that we call for a reconsideration of the democracy agenda precisely to take into consideration some of these values. This is not a political position, but it is rooted in what we assume to be a consensus that the different political groupings in the EU think authoritarianism is a bad thing. And if authoritarianism is spreading globally, that does impinge negatively upon the EU's interests.
To respond to the question about how to define democracy, I think this is going to be key going forward. At International IDEA, we also take elections as part of the definition, credible elections, but that's a very small part of the definition. Of course, you need credible elections and free political parties, but you also need independent courts, respect for people's rights, including freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of expression, all the way to political equality, gender equality, social group equality, and participation. You need space for civil society to operate, to form and operate freely, for people to join associations, civic engagement. You need, regulation of corruption, the fight against corruption, daily safety, what we call personal integrity and security. So we take a rather broad view of democracy so that it's clear that it's not just about elections, although of course elections are a foundational part of that. In terms of picking up on a question that was posed earlier about how can we be better at countering the narratives, I would actually recall one of the recommendations that is in a recent report that Richard wrote about encouraging and promoting more peer-to-peer dialogue. So we know that authoritarian leaders talk to each other and learn from each other, but democracies are not as strong in this sense, and we need to do more to support learning across and between democracies, including from democracies that are on different points of the spectrum. So even countries that are not considered to have consolidated or advanced democracies have lessons to offer and innovations that have taken root at local levels, which are important to share. So we need more openness to hear each other and to learn from each other going forward. In terms of the question on how can we address freedom of the press declines, the way that we measure it in our data set is we're looking at things like the concentration of media, attacks against journalists, whether in person or online. We're looking at executive or government interference in media or suppression of journalists. And so when we now think about, okay, what do we need to do to counter that in Europe but also elsewhere, we recommend things like really renewed support for public interest journalism, especially at the local level where it is dying out. That can be done through things like tax concessions, so incentivize the public to support public interest journalism and local journalism. We also have recommendations about requiring digital platforms to pay news outlets for content that they include. But of course, that needs to be balanced because smaller platforms can really die with regulation that doesn't consider that they have different interests and may be disadvantaged in an unfair way. We also recommend the establishment of SOS mechanisms for journalists who face those kinds of threats to their physical safety and online safety. So in different countries, it will look different. But in the Americas, we've seen models that include things like live, in real-time response mechanisms that can help journalists with armored cars and personal bodyguards, and accountability, of course, for these kinds of attacks. And then there are lots of organizations around the world who are helping build capacity for journalists to push back against interference, and that ranges from everything from better pay and working conditions for journalists who then don't have to succumb to those pressures, all the way to support for organizations like the International Fund for Public Media, which helps build that kind of capacity. And again, to bring peer-to-peer learning into it, that journalists have platforms to share lessons with each other from across regions and across countries so that this sort of solidarity can be built, but also real-life lessons can be learned and people can share what they've done and what has been successful in the past.
Merci.
Thank you very much. We also have with us the head for the Division Multilateral Democracy and Election Observation from the EEAS, Mr. Neil McCall. I'd like to give you the floor for 3 minutes for your observations and any information and comments you'd like to share. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to this committee for organising this debate, and thank you to the authors of the two studies.
Two studies, the study and the report, once again show us that governments across the world, across the globe, are authoritarian governments are cracking down on freedom of press, on freedom of speech, on undermining and manipulating elections, and on restricting personal freedoms. Now, the paper from Richard highlights a number of elements that underpin this undemocratic positioning, and the Global State of Democracy report shows us what the components of democracy are most under attack. As one member said this morning, Chair, the reversing democratic backsliding is a difficult task, but it should be our collective task to prevent that backsliding in the first place and to push back on authoritarian tendencies whenever they appear. Now, both the study and the report have formulated very valid sets of policy recommendations, but of course we also have to accept that now for the past 5, 6, 10 years, every year or every 6 months, we have another study which shows us the worsening state of affairs of democracy around the world. I think, is this cause for despair? Yes, it is cause for despair, but I think on our side it should reinforce us in our will to not stop us from promoting democracy around the world and to continue working in that direction. The European Union has a number of robust instruments and policies. Some of them were highlighted in the study. For example, we have the EU Action Plan for Human Rights and Democracy, which was endorsed by all 27 member states. We have human rights dialogues, we have political dialogues, we have diplomatic efforts, we have enlargement policies, and we have financial assistance. And all of these have contributed to the EU's commitment to promote and defend democracy, which, as has been highlighted a number of times this morning, is a treaty obligation. Now, what I do take from the studies in particular from both, but in particular from Richard's study, is the notion of a mismatch between pro-democracy discourse and authoritarian dialogue, and it's something which I'd be happy to discuss further after this meeting with both authors. It is also, of course, important that our efforts to support parliaments around the world continues, to support judiciary, to support electoral processes, and to support, of course, journalists, as was said, civil society, women, youth, human rights defenders, and democratic activists. Finally, just a word to say that we, of course, need to, and it's been said a number of times this morning, Chair, that we need to collectively, I think, be better at telling the democracy story, and to be better at making the case for democracy when tackling anti-democratic tendencies. And this is why we'd be happy to continue the conversation, both, of course, in this committee, but with the authors after these meetings. Thank you.
Well, the time has come to give the floor back to my colleague Molnar to conclude this exchange. You have the floor for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all our guests and speakers and all the members for this very interesting discussion. I think that was very, very fruitful, and we get a lot of information about this kind of interference, which are very important to understand, and preparing our papers both in the DROA and the EUDS committee. So thank you so much. Thank you very much again. Thank you for your attendance, and on behalf of the EUDS committee, at this point we conclude and close this meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Saturi, one question.
No, on a fini, Monsieur Molarzik.
No, sorry, we finished. You've had a lot of time to take the floor. The session is suspended and we'll come back at 10:45.
Unbelievable.